to me, and I have my notes. I have my notebook with me, and I am going to tell Babs tomorrow to go ahead and print them again, and they'll show up after I print them. I guarantee it. But chapter 18, and this is about the fall of Babylon. Now, in the Bible, ancient Babylon was that's one of them dry ones there. I think I forgot to throw it away. Ancient Babylon was an empire that, if you looked at the map today, it's where Iraq and Iran, of course, Iran was west of these two together and some other territories. It was a pretty sizable empire. They were in existence after around 722 BC. They became very strong. They went north and west and conquered a group of people called the Assyrians. That was an empire. And the Assyrians were enemies to Israel for decades. But they defeated the Assyrians, so they controlled all of the northern area coming into where Israel's located on the Mediterranean Sea. When they came into Israel, back then, when empires conquered other territories, their biggest thing was to get their gold, their silver, their, stuff like that, but also to get their food. And when empires conquered empires, they were, violent. They destroyed religious symbols. They, brought their culture in, which the Babylonians were pretty wicked people. And they didn't believe in one God, they believed in multiple gods. But this area where the Babylonians came from, if you go back centuries, it's where Abraham came from. They were called Chaldeans. And they migrated over, Abraham did, and came here. So his family was before the Babylonians. So when you read these names in the Bible, one territory conquers another one. But anyway, Babylon was the empire that God used to bring judgment against the southern portion, because up here is the 10 tribes that eventually were defeated and carried out by the Assyrians. Well, when the Assyrians came in here, of course, they knew all about Jerusalem and stuff, but they never were able to take Jerusalem. Tribe of Judah was down here, and the tribe of Benjamin. So this is by the way, Jesus comes from the Judah tribe, so that's a remnant. So these Babylonians came in here, defeated the Assyrians, and this territory had already been defeated, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And so that meant that once they took over all this, they could just march into here. And at the time, when we read the book of Jeremiah, not Jeremiah, but the book of Isaiah, long before it happened, and a few of the other prophets, God was pretty upset with the southern part of the kingdom and said he would bring in some people to conquer them, carry them into captivity, and bring them back to teach them a lesson, so to speak. And that's what happened. And the prophets talked about it hundreds of years before it happened. So the Babylonians come in here, defeat Jerusalem. Jeremiah is the prophet in the city of Jerusalem. Ezekiel goes into captivity. He's over here, and they're prophesying over here to the people who got carried out. And you got the cities destroyed. Things are pretty bad. And the Babylonians are ruling. Well, the name Babylon is a symbol and figurative symbol of the anti-God society. Let's just call it that, okay? The anti-God society. So when you see the name Babylon in the New Testament, Babylon was not in existence. It had been centuries since they went out of existence. But their culture of not believing in the one true God existed in other nations. Everybody follow me? I'm kind of go slow enough to get you a picture of this. So when John writes to, from the island of Patmos, and he sees these visions, we see him using Babylon a lot to kind of symbolize this anti-God society. But when John wrote, the empire that was in control were the Romans. So The word Babylon, which was ancient, became kind of like equal to the Romans, and it was kind of like a code name. And if you don't want to upset the Romans, you don't say, well, God doesn't like you, or you're wicked people and God's going to judge the Romans or what like that, because the emperor would get you. So they would just kind of use Babylon to symbolize this world power at the time. Everybody with me? So it became a symbol of wickedness and became a symbol of the anti-God society that's been in every empire, all the way up to today. You still see what we would call Babylonian beliefs, no God. When we're seeing it in our country, they're trying to remove God completely from our culture. That's a type of Babylonian beliefs that, you should have multiple gods, your wealth and things like that are more important than your worship of the true God. And that being said, the 18th chapter, John sees a vision where God brings judgment against Babylon. Now, in our Bibles and in people interpreting what was he talking about, I see Babylon as a reference to this. Some people say it's a reference to the old city called Babylon. And that, God's just kind of fulfilling his prophecy that one day Babylon would go out of existence. In other words, he's going to defeat the anti-God society. So some people see it as a city. So when we read this and you see what's going to happen to them, some people have said, boy, that looks like America. And there are some guys, and I read a book a couple of years ago that the guy came out and he gave the case that the anti-God society is America. And that we're moving away from God, and we are very rapidly. And, if the Constitution goes, then you can hang all the Christians up in a tree, because that's the only thing keeping us out of trouble. Because the world out there doesn't like God's beliefs. The world doesn't like righteousness. We as Christians stand in the way of the world doing its thing, and that is controlling people, killing people, man being elevated above other men, so forth and so on, like communism and everything else. But Christians represent God, so in a society, we're like salt of the earth and light. We prevent them from doing that, and when our founding fathers put the Constitution in, it's based on the Bible. And they put the Second Amendment in there to keep tyrants from undoing the Constitution. And I read an article just yesterday, said right now in America, with the hunters that have guns and the people that own guns, there's somewhere estimated 40 million people that are gun owners. Did y'all know that? It's the largest army in the world. 40 million people have guns. And he said, in describing our nation, he said, that's the reason why the Japanese never wanted to invade us. That's why the Germans didn't try to send an armada of ships over here. They had torpedoes to their subs, but that's the reason why they didn't invade us. And because if you come in here, then you got to do house to house and street to street fighting to take over people. You'll destroy everything, just kind of like what they're doing in Ukraine. Russia eventually is going to run out of resources trying to fight that crazy war, because the Ukrainians ain't giving up. But if you come to America, we have the largest standing civilian army in the world. And even our leaders know that. So they keep trying to chip away to get us to weaken that, to get the guns back from us. Because the anti-God society wants a world governed by a dictator, the Antichrist, and a government that does not represent God, and they can kill people wholesale and do what they want to, and everything else without the Christians standing in their way. Think about it. Every social thing that comes up, the Christians oppose that which is opposed to God's word, abortion. We're standing in the way of that being, and it's almost reversed because of the efforts of Christians. The cloning of human beings. They want to do that right now. But we say that's God's business and not your business. So science can play with human, creation and stuff. We're standing in the way of that, And I could go on and on and on. And then even our laws against homosexual behaviors and things like that. I mean, homosexuals are adopting children now. And you think about that. That's not a good thing. Because, first of all, that's not their blood and kin. So they're actually raising up kids to become sexual prostitutes within their homes, and that's what they do. Well, a lot of states have laws on the books to prevent that, but they're working hard to get rid of those laws so that sodomy and sexual behaviors with children are not against the law. See, y'all don't know those battles. I do, because I've been in and fighting them, I used to go up to the legislature, and every time I found out something, I'd go up there and raise Cain. And, through the year, I'm getting old now, so the old dog ain't got as much bite as they used to have. But I see it. And it's very slow. It's kind of like a cancer just eating away at our culture. Because at the root of our culture is a belief in God and righteousness and holiness and decency and respect for human life. See, I don't care how sinners live. I don't want to control their lives. If they want to live like that, doesn't bother me one bit. Don't bring it into my schools and into my streets and my cities and tell me that's normal, because that's when I have the right, So, that being said, they can't force us, because we've been blessed to live in a country that has the Second Amendment to protect the First Amendment and all the other ones to give us rights. That's not true in the rest of the world. So that being said, Babylon is symbolic of this anti-God society, and it's a code word for the Romans at the time, because that was the empire, and they were not any different than the Babylonians. It's kind of like, if you got weeds growing in your yard, and you try to get rid of them. You can get rid of them, but you have to keep working at it to get rid of them. The other day at work, the guy who's the superintendent of the golf course, he was in front of the building, and he was running around checking everything, and I saw him out there underneath the flagpole, and he was pulling weeds by hand. I said, man, as much as you know about weeds and grass, why are you pulling them by hand? He said, Bobby, I've sprayed this area and sprayed this area, and he said, they keep coming back. And that's the way evil is. One generation can kind of, just like Hitler. You get rid of Hitler, they raise up a Mussolini. You get rid of Mussolini, they raise up a Stalin. You get rid of Stalin, they raise up somebody else. You get rid of, in Cuba, you get rid of him, and now his son's in power. It's just like they're everywhere. And we are opposed to this, and this society is working against us. And during the tribulation, it's when it's going to hit the fan. The power that's evil will actually rise up and control the world for a short time, but God's going to bring the hammer down and deal with them, okay? I know that's a long introduction, but that's kind of what's going on in this chapter here. So the fall of Babylon describes back what John said in chapter 16 and verse 19, that one day Babylon would fall. So it represents evil civilization in general, not just one specific city. It collapses physically and economically. So it's going to be a collapse that is pretty devastating. And the whole world will know what God's doing. And it'll happen in almost an instant, okay? Now, in verses 1 through 3, let's read those. Let me get up back into my Bible here. Any questions so far? Does everybody understand what I mean by Babylon now? That's what John's talking about. But in Revelation, hold on a minute, 18. Verse 1, John says, and after this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. With a mighty voice he shouted, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling for demons and a haunt for every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, and a haunt or dwelling place for every unclean and detestable animal. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries. Now, that's the reason why that guy who I was talking about wrote the book, Babylon, and compared it to America, because we are the richest nation in this world, okay? But in our excessiveness, we have turned to pollute the rest of the world with a lot of our, sinfulness and ungodliness. And rather than promoting righteousness, we're actually, starting to do that. In verse 2, Babylon has been so decimated, there are no people left. And the adultery that is mentioned here is a spiritual adultery. So the nations that go along with the Babylon or anti-God society, this society actually causes other nations through commerce, through trade, through political alliances, to adopt a culture that is against God and actually polluted the earth that way. Now, this may seem strange to you, but Islam, what do they refer to America? What do they call America? The great what? The great Satan. See, in their religion, though they are hypocritical in many things they do, they see America as opposed to Allah, which has a moral code, and that the perversive behaviors with the homosexuals, you know what they do to homosexuals in that culture? Do y'all know what they do to them? They kill them. If they're publicly known to be a homosexual, they kill them. I'm not saying we do that, but I'm just telling you, they feel that strong about it, that it's a sin that can't pollute their culture. And so when they look at America and see us, what is it, Gay Pride Month this month? That's everywhere.
And the Marines are in support of it.
Do what? The Marines? Really?
I heard it on the news this week.
Wow. But we went to Disney World years ago when this thing first got started. And, Disney basically supports those behaviors. And, of course, they have the parades and things like that. And we'll probably do they have them in Augusta? Yeah, they had one in Augusta last year, if I remember. Yeah. Because we made the mistake of going down there one night and didn't know it. And we went into a restaurant, and we saw all these people coming out with, just strange-looking people for us. And Gail said, I wonder what's going on. Then you see the big rainbow colors. And so I went back and got on the internet, and that's what it was. It was Gay Pride.
It's a shame that they use that symbol because little ones love it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm waiting for it to say, what are you proud of, being a sinner?
No, you're exactly right. Those behaviors are, if you look in Romans chapter 1, in fact, I want you to turn there right now. I read it a few weeks ago, but I want to read it again. Because when we're talking about Babylon here in chapter 18, look in Romans chapter 1, and you'll see what the anti-God society looks like. Paul gives a description of it. Now, you got to remember, he's living during the day of the Romans, and this is what they tolerated. This is what they said was right. Listen to the description beginning in verse number 18. It says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people, who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that the people are without excuse. So the creation itself declares who God is. He says, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. They call Thanksgiving Turkey Day now, like some kind of bird we ought to be grateful for. The only thing a turkey's good for is to eat, But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lust. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so they do what ought not to be done. Listen to this. They've become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity. That means faithfulness or loyalty in marriage. No love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Comment. What does that sound like?
Exactly.
See, Sodom and Gomorrah, if you read your Bible in Genesis, when Lot, their families got so big, and that was a nephew of Abraham, their flocks and herds, God was blessing them, and there was friction between the family. It gotten so big. And I think it had more to do with Lot's wife, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But they said, we need to separate. And so Abraham said, well, look where you want to go. And he says, well, we're looking down toward the southeast, and there's some cities down there. There were 5 cities. 2 of them were named Sodom and Gomorrah, but there were 3 other cities there. And he said, it's rich, the place you can, at the time, is a place to raise your animals, at farmland, whatever. And he said he decided that's where he wanted to live, him and his family. Well, when they got there, of course, things got bad. Abraham had to go down there and help him out for a while, but they stayed. And then over a process of time, being in those 2 cities, we know that Sodom and Gomorrah, that's where we get our word sodomy from, that there was sexual behaviors and things going on. It had reached a low level. This is the description of Sodom and Gomorrah. And see, it doesn't happen overnight. When you've got a God society and it becomes an anti-God society, that's a slow trickle. And they start with the children. They always start with the children. Hitler started with the children. The communists start with the children to capture their minds, destroy their history, destroy their religion, and get them almost indoctrinated into the New World Order so that they forget God and His ways. When I grew up in the schools, the BIBLE was still in the classrooms. We had it. It ended after the 60s and the early 70s. But even the basic readers, it was the ABCs, and they were scripture verses. All have sinned and fallen short. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. And what was C? Do y'all remember what C was? I forget. It was a scripture verse. And that's how they learned, how children learned, and it was the primary readers, and it was in public schools. Because, see, our Constitution has nothing about education in it. Have you ever read it? Nothing. Well, the federal government controls our schools. No, we let them control our schools. And how do we do it? They created a Department of Education, a cabinet position in the late 50s. It was a slick move. We need to dissolve the Department of Education, because when they did that, the Department of Education has tax dollars, and attached to those tax dollars are red tape, strings attached to control the schools and dictate what books they can have and what philosophies and beliefs they get. And so now schools are under the control, because now they've been taking from the federal government for so long that if you cut off the federal money from the schools, a lot of the school districts would dry up. But if you do your math, and I've done it, you do your math and look at the dollars that comes in from the feds. For about every dollar that the feds give us, you spend almost $3 trying to meet the standards of your own money so you can get the federal money. That's how they got into our culture, and that's where they're controlling our children. And now it's exploited so far, a lot of parents are pulling their kids out of public schools and putting them into private schools, or either homeschooling them to get away from it, because they recognize there's not much they can do. And, when you send your kids off, and I'm saying that all the public schools are totally bad because we got Christians in them. But the problem is those Christians have their hands tied because they can't say much about God. And if they do, they get called on the carpet and can lose their jobs, But what I'm trying to show you is this anti-God society, symbol Babylon. How you get from a God society to this, you do it very slowly, and you start with the children. You capture the minds of the children, and it takes several generations. In the Bible, it says the sins of the fathers and this is several times in the Old Testament, the sins of the fathers is visited upon the children in the third and the fourth generation. Now, generation is about the average age that a male has his first child, which means married and has a family. Back then, it was around the age of 20. So every 20 years, so if you say third or fourth generation, in 60 years, that's 3 generations. Subtract 60 from where we are today, and where does that put you? 1962. And the sins of the fathers was what? Get rid of God. And now we're in that third generation. And if our math is right, the fourth generation is going to be a nightmare. And when you look at these kids, who's going into these schools and shooting kids? It's kids. Who's doing all the crime? And they're getting younger and younger. So all I'm saying is, God's going to judge this anti-God society because they corrupt the mind of children. They control us with wickedness, and you see a description of it here. Sodom and Gomorrah didn't happen overnight. It was a process. And that's where we are now. Sometimes I feel helpless, and then I realize God's in control. So I never get so anxious that, because I know even if the society collapses all the way, he'll come and get us, with the rapture. So that's my hope. But I'm still called upon to be salt and light. So we have to speak up and we have to shine. Now, in verse number, that I just read to you, verse number 3, let's go to verses 4 and 5. It says I lost my place. Here we go. In verse 4 and 5, it says, "Then I heard another voice from heaven say, 'Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes.'" Notice the feminine pronoun that is used to describe Babylon. One of the things about the ancient Babylonians was they used feminine terms to describe many of their gods. In fact, the goddess of the earth, Gaia, Gaia, was worshipped as Mother Earth. And what do we do today? And the weatherman says, well, Mother Nature. See, that's an old reference to an old belief that the earth is some feminine goddess that has life and gives life. And that's what's behind a lot of the movement for the climate change and stuff, is to get our money to convince us we're destroying Mother Earth, which is not a living entity. Mother Earth is a creation of God that supports life. It's not a living thing like we were created in the image of God. Earth is just a mass of trees and animals and things. But the thing is, it's not a God. And, God said multiply and fill the earth. So I think he knows when it'll fill up. You know what I'm saying? And he has control of everything. So why should we interfere through governments except to take somebody else's money and force us to do things we don't want to do, And that's behind that. And there's a lot of people who believe that. But look at this. We are to leave this anti-God society and basically be spiritually separate. Like I said to you this morning, we are to live our lives in such a way, though we're in a dark world, a corrupt world, we are to live our lives according to God's word, and we'll stick out like a star shining in the sky. We don't tell people that we're better than them, because we're not. We're sinners saved by grace. We don't go out and try to force them, through argument. I had a deacon friend of mine. We had this guy we played golf with a lot, and he was a Jew. He's Jewish, and he doesn't go, but he's Jewish. And my friend, one day, when I wasn't around, got into a discussion about becoming a Christian. Well, the Jewish guy just didn't want to become one at the time. Well, my friend, who I'm real close to, he's a lot older than me, he got in an argument with him. Well, later on, when me and this other guy were playing golf together and the other guy wasn't around, he says, "Can I ask you something, preacher?" I said, "Yeah, what's that?" He said, "Why did he get so angry at me because I wouldn't become a Christian?" I said, "His desire to see you saved puts him in an adversarial position." And he said, "Yeah, but you've never done that. And I know what you believe and I know who you are." And I said, "Well, even though he's older than me, he's still learning. You can't beat people over the head with the Bible. So to be stars, live your life according to God, and they'll get it. Because this anti-God society is like walking in a dark room with no lights. I mean, that's how different it is. And today it's getting worse. And, you know, what they love to do is pick on us as Christians and fault find us and tell us, well, you're not as good as Christians you think you are, make fun of us and things like that. Well, let's don't give them any reason. Be blameless, as Paul said this morning. Don't give them a reason to do that, okay? All right, let's go to the next verses, 6 through 8. In verses 6 through 8, it says, give back to her, speaking of Babylon, as she has given. Pay her back double for what she has done. Pour her a double portion from her own cup. Give her as much torment and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. In her heart she boasts, I sit enthroned as queen. I am not a widow. I will never mourn. Therefore, in one day her plagues will overtake her. Death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. So in these verses, there's a cry of vengeance and for God to do something against the evils of this Babylonian or anti-God society. And God says he will. Now, if you go back and look just for a moment, you see the word queen. There again, there's that feminine reference to a feminine goddess who they saw as the kind of chief god over their culture. And it's just a reference to the queen mother, you might say, and of a god that doesn't exist, but they paid honor to. And she says, hey, I'm not mourning because I'm in charge. I don't have a husband. I'm in rule of everything. But God says, give her a double portion of what she's given out. So he's saying that one day there's going to be a payday someday. Okay? All right, the next few verses. Verses 9 through 20. These are laments. A lament is a weeping and crying about something that is evil and that God's going to bring judgment against. But these are laments about the fall of Babylon. The first group is in verses 9 through 10. This is the kings of the earth. The second group that's going to be judged is in verse 11. These are the merchants. And the third group is in verse 17. The shipmaster and sailors, okay? They all lament because they all have lost their material wealth. So let's read some of these verses down through verse 17, okay? Well, in verse 12, the products that are lost too. In verse number 12, let me put my finger on it. It says here, the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Cargoes of gold, silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet. These are expensive items, by the way. Cloth, scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood, which was used for shipbuilding, and articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble. Cargoes of cinnamon and spice, of incense and myrrh, and frankincense, of wine, olive oil, of fine flour, and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages, human beings sold as slaves. They will say, the fruit you long for is gone from you. All your luxury and splendor have vanished, never to be recovered. The merchants who sold these things and gained their wealth from her will stand far off, terrified at her torment. They will weep and mourn and cry out, woe, woe to you, great city, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and glittering with gold and precious stones and pearls. And listen to this. God gives a specific. In 1 hour, such great wealth has been brought to ruin. Every sea captain and all who travel by ship, the sailors and all who earn their living from the sea will stand afar off. And when they see the smoke of her burning, they will exclaim, was there ever a city like this great city? They will throw dust on their heads and with weeping and mourning cry out, woe, woe to you, great city, where all who had ships on the sea became rich through her wealth. In 1 hour she has been brought to ruin. Rejoice over her, you heavens. Notice this. Rejoice, you people of God. Rejoice, apostles and prophets, for God has judged her with the judgment she opposed on you. God says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. So through the history of man, this anti-God culture has always existed. Babylon becomes a symbol here in Revelation. At the time, it was the Romans. But all the wickedness and perversiveness that's found in this anti-God society that lives according to man's laws, that basically promote evil, they will persecute Christians. And they do that today around the world. We've been blessed here in this country. But God says there's coming a payday for this. He says in 1 hour, this whole system will collapse. And all those who made their wealth from this system will lose everything. Now, let me just give you a couple of scenarios. In 1929, well, it's not just 1929, but that was probably one of the most familiar ones. The stock market crashed, and it was so severe that, billions of dollars then were lost, and it caused the country to go into poverty. And a lot of people lost everything they had. Now, some of you might be children of the post-crash. I know my daddy, who died at 89, he was a child just before World War II. And, before World War II, you got about 10 years. I think he was 10 years. And he talked about his daddy losing his business. And they had to move here and work in the mills. And, I talked to Miss Bull and Gail's mother and them, and they talked about how it was pretty tough. They got by. But Daddy said he was so tired of just eating beans and stuff, to get what they could. He would shine shoes to make a dime to take home to his mama to help them try to, So it was bad. Before that, 1873 was another period. Before the Civil War, 1857, I think it was. These are periods when the economic system reached a point of collapsing. But we recovered. We recovered from the Civil War. That was devastating both to the South and the North, not only losing Americans, but losing property. So we've seen that as a nation. But this here is going to happen in 1 hour. So all I can say to you is, this anti-God system worldwide is going to collapse. And when it does, all those who are associated with it, are going to have the impact. Now you say, what about the believers in God who are existing when that happens? Well, we believe in the rapture before the tribulation, so we're hoping we'll be out of here. But there's going to be a few believers around, but God's going to take care of them. And they'll stick out like sore thumbs because if they're still living for God, they'll be spotted as being people that don't go along with this system. When Lot left the city, I meant to tell you this. When Lot left the city, who did he take with him when he left Sodom and Gomorrah? Do you remember the angels come and got him? Who left with him? You remember? His wife and how many daughters? 2. And what did his wife do? The word look back does not mean just a visible look. Her heart was such that she was going back. She told her husband, I'm not leaving. And she started back, and that's when she turned to, and in that area today, and I haven't been to the Holy Land, but I've seen pictures of this, there's a stone made out of ash and stuff like from a volcano, and it's in the shape of a woman, and and it stands there. Go look it up, you can Google the picture, and through the ages they said that's her, that she literally turned to stone from the falling of the ash and stuff as she made her way back to Sodom and Gomorrah. And of course his 2 daughters were corrupt. They had already been corrupted because later on they get their daddy drunk and things happen. So they had problems. So that culture impacted them in a negative fashion. But I'm going to say to you is in just a few hours, those 2 cities were wiped off the face of the earth to this day. There's never been another civilization living there. And he says, Jesus talking about Sodom and Gomorrah says it will be worse for those living today that reject him and reject. So if we aren't born again, we're under the wrath of God. We'll be a part, not us, but those who aren't saved, will be a part of this anti-God society. And there's going to be some people that live pretty good lives, but they don't believe in Jesus. They're under his wrath. Everybody with me? But it's going to happen very, very quickly. 7 categories of products are mentioned. precious stones, costly cloth. Notice the color scarlet. To have anything with color in it back then was very, very expensive. In fact, to get silken material, you had to go to India and even to China. And the people in the West, which means Europe and the Roman Empire and all this stuff, loved those kind of fabrics. The Romans craved them. And so you had trade routes going there getting all that. So this kind of material would be like having expensive clothing today. The merchants there. Spices and fragrances. They mention the ones that are most expensive. Expensive food like wine, flour, and oil. Animals, sheep, horses, and chariots, which would refer to the military. And then, of course, people. And back then, slavery was a commodity that was used to help to support the economy. And they, too, are a part of this. Then in the final 3 verses, and like I said, I'll give you some notes next week so you can go back over some of this. In verse number 21, then a mighty angel picked up a boulder the size of a large millstone and threw it into the sea and said, with such violence, the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again. The music of harpists and musicians, pipers and trumpets will never be heard in you again. No worker of any trade will ever be found in you again. The sound of a millstone will never be heard in you again, the people that produce food. The light of a lamp will never shine in you again. For us, no electricity. The voice of a bridegroom and bride will never be heard in you again, so the family will be completely done away with. Your merchants were the world's important people. By your magic spell, all the nations were led astray. In her was found the blood of prophets and of God's holy people, of all who have been slaughtered on the earth. So all of this is basically following 3 categories that will experience the wrath of God. The entertainment world. Now, let me ask you a question. If you go back in the Old Testament, this is a trivia question for you. Who were the ones, who was the character associated with music? What was his name? It's in Genesis. All right, y'all know Cain, right? What's the first part of it? There was another guy called Jubal-Cain. He was a descendant from Cain. Jubal-Cain, it says in there, was the first rock star back then with a harp. He created music for the secular world, as you would think. And so, because Cain's descendants were anti-God, they're part of this anti-God society. So Jubal-Cain was the first one that used music to promote evil and stuff. Now, if some of you in here are old enough to remember this, when Elvis Presley come out, what did the preacher say about Elvis Presley? Y'all remember? Huh? What did they say about Elvis Presley? Huh? Yeah, of the devil. Said he was nothing but from the devil. But there's a lot of people like him. You know, they got a movie on him coming out soon talking about his life. He died a short life on drugs and things. You know, it seemed like all these rock stars followed the path of...
And have something to keep them going.
Yeah, exactly. You can't burn yourself out on both ends. I mean, on a candle, you know, it gives up. But after Elvis Presley and people like him, Buddy Holly and all these others, who was the group that came from England and invaded America? The Beatles. And I know you know what I'm talking about at Butler. The boys starting to let the hair get longer. Daddy was shaving mine. I had the GI haircut for a long time. And then I finally got to grow hair. I had to comb it up like his. But the Beatles sang, and then you had the hippies. And all their music, you know, if you heard the parents then, what were they saying? It's of the devil, you know. And, you know, the teenagers didn't see it. But then the music, and now we've progressed so far. We got different, you know, genres of music. You got country music, you got, you know, rock music, pop music, then you got rap music. And some of the lyrics in these songs are just outright filthy. And it can be traced back to the 50s and even before to New Orleans, which if you've ever been to New Orleans with jazz and stuff, that's a strange development. But it says that the entertainment world will be one of the targets. And when you look at Hollywood and all that's going on, it'll go down with Babylon. The works or crafts. people who are in charge of the industry side of society, their businesses will collapse. It will be taken away. And then the pleasant events of life will also, you might say, get a black eye. But there again, depending on what commentaries you read, and I've read several on this subject, some people see it as a literal city in our world that represents that. Some people said it's Rome. Well, Rome doesn't impact the world like it used to. Some people said it's, this guy that wrote the book about America, he said, well, New York and New Orleans and, what's the gambling center out there, Las Vegas, San Francisco, they named all the major cities, and he says that, they all kind of incorporate this anti-God society, And, to me, if California cracked off and floated out toward China, it'd probably be a good, China owns half of it anyway, so might as well give it to them. But my point is, some scholars will tell you it's a city. Others see it as the whole anti-God society throughout the world, that the economic system will collapse, the productivity of that, so everything will collapse, and it will cause great famine. And of course, this is great for the Antichrist because he can step up to the bat and say, hey, I can fix this. Like, what's his name, Biden? He says we're better off now than we were before. Do y'all believe that? But watch him carefully when he goes to news conferences. Watch who's right there beside him or near him. You know who it is? It's his wife. She's off in the shadows, off to the side, because if he loses it, she'll know it first. And that's why they got it. The other night he was giving a speech, and I saw in the back of the stage. You didn't see that with Trump, unless they were having an appearance together, his wife. You didn't see it with any president. They got their aides around him, not your wife. But she knows when he's fixing to flip out like he does at the White House when nobody else is around. But, he's not going to help us. Whoever is in control at the time, the Antichrist, can step up to the bat, fill the vacancy, and say, hey, look, we can fix this. And what do you think people will do? They'll follow him. So anyway, John tells us there's coming a day, a payday, when those that are against us. Because see, I'm going to tell y'all haven't experienced this. I have there's people out there that hate God and they hate us. I've seen it. See, I used to go to abortion clinic all the time, and that's where you see it. You go to places like that where you're protesting something they believe in, you'll get it. And I told one woman one day, she was spewing out all kinds of nasty stuff, and I said, why are you so full of hate? She said, well, y'all trying to stop what is our right, protect our bodies and stuff. I said, no, we're trying to keep y'all from killing babies. Well, that's your opinion. Y'all just need to leave from here. Just full of hate. Spit at us, call us names. And one of them was dressed up in a clown suit one day, and I walked up behind her. And she had her clown outfit on with her face painted, and I walked up behind her. I said, can I tell you something? I had to do Lord, it wasn't the Lord, it was me. I said, God can see through that paint and that wig you got on your head. I said, you might be a clown out here. I said, but you're going to have to answer for this. And because we would be standing there with our signs, they would come around and get in front of us to try to irritate us. And I've seen the hate. I really have, toward Christians. And if we take a stand for righteousness, you go to this gay pride thing in Augusta and stand on the street with a sign and say, God loves you and there's a better life than the life you're living. Jesus comes to give you abundant life. See what happens to you and your sign. If you get by without somebody letting you have it, then, we'd be standing there and people right by shooting us the finger and yelling out from the cars, who do y'all think y'all are, And like I said, threatening and everything else. And I said, you get to see, if you take a stand for righteousness, even in the halls of Congress or state legislature, which I've been many a time, and you go up there and try to oppose stuff, I'll tell you this and I'm going to shut up. Before I left Ridge Baptist, several of the local political leaders, they had to pick state school board members. Well, some of them said, we need to get you on the state school board. You know so much about education, you know the history, you know where they're going, you know their agenda. And I've done a lot of research, I'm telling you, it's not pretty, and I don't have time to tell you all of it. And said, we need you on there because we know you'll you'll be wise enough to find a way to try to get the truth, back into education. Because I started a school in our church, so I know what kids need to learn and what they don't need to learn. But anyway, I went to the meeting to get affirmed, and I was the only one. As I stood up to give my reason for wanting to do it, one of the guys up there said, well, I got on the internet and I saw where you gave a speech and you're very opposed to abortion. Very outspoken. I said, yeah, it's killing babies and I think we need to be opposed and I have a right to do that. Well, that's too controversial. I said, what's the school board got to do with that? See? And then he said, well, we saw where you gave another speech at a political meeting. They had asked you come to talk about America and what needs to be done. And you made the comment that if the government continues and if Hillary got to be president, because I did mention her, that probably a lot of Christian preachers would be in jail. She hates us. Well, that was on the video. And I said, yeah, I said that. And I said, that's the truth. And he says, well, I'd like to nominate somebody else here tonight. He's in the room. I'm opposed to you being here. And I think I lost by 2 votes. So when it was over, several of the ones who had nominated come in and said, preacher, we never would have put you in that situation if we knew what his agenda was. He said, he had no right attacking he said, you were just going to be a school board. I said, no, but hell knows what I was going to do if I got on there. I was going to be very quiet, harmless as a dove, slick as a snake, and find ways, because, he got like 12 board members, I think, in the whole state or something like that. And it's a very influential part. Well, it kind of bothered me that I got turned down, but then I got to thinking about it. I took a stand. I got nominated to do that. They turned me down. So in a way, that was their way of saying, we don't want you in our system. So I've seen it. I've felt it. I don't know. I guess I'm good.
We had the same experience locally with our children.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually, as Christians, you would think there's a lot of Christians around here that would
Take a stand.
the same thing, but you cannot even make these people stand up or be actually do anything proactive. So, we pulled our kids out of the school, and I mean, they were in classrooms with self-professed Christian people, but they're not standing up.
They don't take a stand for anything. Well, some of the political parties, because see, the school board is supposed to be non-political. So the Republican Party said, we need somebody like you on the local school board. So would you run for that? And I said, well, let me pray about it and think about it. So I decided I'd do it. But then we had another lady in the church. She's dead now, but they were close friends of us. And she was interested. I said, well, we both represent the same thing. And I said, you probably have a better chance getting elected than me. And so we got her elected. Well, she got up there and her head got too big because she was in there for a couple of terms. And that's when they were bringing in the homosexual sex education. And I got a hold of material. I had people sending me material and said, preacher, watch this. I couldn't watch it. It was filthy. And the teachers were having to be trained. And for the state would give money from the federal government if you taught this in your school. And they didn't care what you did with the money, but you had to teach this stuff. So I got riled up my church and told them from the pulpit, we're going to the school board. And we took a bunch of rebel rousers up there. And she sat right there and opposed us. And everybody looked at me and said, preacher, I don't know why I said, me either. I said, I'm sorry that I ever didn't go up there myself, And I said, apparently they got to her head. And they took the money. And but we had about 35 from my church. Oh, Gail will tell you, she said, you're just a rebel rouser. You're always up here. And I'm not saying that boastfully. I just felt like, you got to do something. So I don't want to get to heaven. And the Lord said, why didn't you at least try? That's all he asked you to do. And we won some victories. The hospital in Charleston was taking baby fetal tissue, as they call it, from the abortion clinic, because we saw the box on the outside the abortion clinic. It had MUSC, Medical College, University of South Carolina Medical College, tissue for the MUSC, and the truck would come in, pick it up, and take it back. So a lady called me who went to the clinic more than I did, and she said, preacher, they're taking baby material, and they're doing research on it at the state hospital. I said, you got to be kidding me. She said, no, I've seen them. I followed them. So I called the head of the board of directors. They didn't have one, so I had to talk with the second in command. Preacher, we wouldn't be doing anything like that, but I'll look into it. So I wrote letters to the governor, which was Haley. Got a stupid form letter back from her. I mean, we were fighting it left and right. I had children write letters to the governor, had children write letters, say, don't kill our children, and don't use the tissue for research and stuff. And it kept on. I found one preacher that go with me, and we had a news conference. And it was just me and him. And we went down there across the street from the hospital. We didn't get on their property, and we held a news conference, and we told it like it was. I said, they're taking babies after they abort them, and they're using them for research in the hospital. One of the nurses in our church worked for one of the OBGYN doctors. She came to me in church and cornered me and said, how dare you attack her? She's the head of the department. She wouldn't do anything like that. I said, I know more than you know. She wouldn't come back to church. She was mad about, because I was doing, she said, you're attacking my boss, and she's a good lady. I said, no, she's doing what they did in Nazi Germany. She's using people. And so anyway, I kept on, and I kept on. And finally, thanks to God, the word was getting out to the public. And see, you can't use tax money to abort babies. And indirectly, that's what they were doing. Taking the babies and over here. And all of a sudden, they got a new head of the thing, and they did away with the program. I'm not looking for a star in my crown. I just know to be salt and light, you have to do your homework. You have to be willing to take a stand like Daniel. You have to be like, now you're singing a country western song. But seriously, and like on your school board taking a stand, you may be the only one. That's all God wants. But I'm going to tell you this, when you get to heaven, he'll say, well done, thy good and faithful servant.
Actually, you provided, it was a God thing. A friend of ours said, are you looking for somebody to help homeschool? Because, I'm a nurse, I was working. And we're like, yeah, we are. And there was a local principal who quit her job as a principal at elementary school around here because she said she could no longer push the state agenda onto the children. Like they have the books that were promoting homosexuality.
That's right.
That's in your local schools right now.
Yes.
So she quit and she started her own business, like doing homeschool. And she comes to our house and homeschools our kids. So, he provided even though
It'd be wonderful if we get 2 more people to do that,
Yeah. Well, the founding